All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to be learning how to write a WRA2. This is a position paper, so it's different than a WRA1, especially in the sense that you come up with a position or an opinion. Now, what's important about having an opinion is making sure that you can back it up. So you're going to be using case studies, evidence, and thinkers to prove that your position is correct. Now it says on here Social Studies 20-1. The assignment is exactly the same for 10-1 and 30-1. So this tutorial will be applicable for all. Right off the bat, you're going to see that the assignment box, it is different. The question that's being asked is, to what extent should we embrace the ideological perspectives reflected in the source? Write an essay in which you must analyze the source and demonstrate an understanding of the ideological perspectives reflected in the source. Establish and argue a position in response to the question presented, and support your position and arguments by using evidence from your knowledge and understanding of social studies. Right off the bat, you're seeing that there's a different set of instructions here. In this tutorial, there is no source given, but you will be given a source, most likely a quote. Now I'm going to move between screens here. I'm going to go to this canvas to just show you a little bit about the structure of a WRA2. Paragraph 1. This is going to be something that you've done before. Now it's a little bit different, but essentially the same as a WRA1. Paragraph 1 is a source analysis. So you are using IVDT, just like you would in a WRA1. It's a quote. It might be a big quote, might be small. So you're going to be using things like the chunking technique. You're breaking it down. You're providing a thinker. And at the end of paragraph 1, so at the end of your source analysis, this is where we have a thesis. Some of you are going to be familiar with what a thesis statement is. Some of you may not. A thesis is your position. We're going to go over this in detail for every single paragraph. I just want to show you briefly what the structure is like. Paragraph 2. This is your first argument. With an argument, you have 2 case studies. Paragraph 3. Argument 2. Another 2 case studies. Paragraph 4 is your conclusion. So this is a 4-paragraph assignment. There might be some students who write this in more paragraphs. I don't recommend that. Stick with the 4-paragraph format. Now let's get into each section on their own. Here's some terminology just to help guide you. National perspective, a feeling of belonging, how an individual or group interacts with each other in the world. Analyze. This means to break down a source into its component parts. You've learned how to do this in a WRA1. Demonstrate. To show, describe, explain, or illustrate by examples. Establish and argue a position. Now, this is your thesis statement. Your thesis statement is a specific, direct answer to the topic question. Now, let's go back to the question. It's always going to be this. To what extent should we embrace the ideological perspective reflected in the source? This is why we begin with a source analysis. You have to be able to identify what the source's perspective is before you can say if we should agree or disagree with it. That should make sense to you. You have to know what the source is saying in order to agree or disagree with it. So, components of the position paper. We have a position, we have arguments, examples, and a source analysis. Together they form your WRA2. When you are done your WRA2, you're going to be sure that you have a thesis, so a specific direct answer or statement to topic, statement, and source. You are proving your thesis with arguments, depth and breadth of a position. We'll explain that in greater detail. And you're validating your arguments with evidence. Evidence equals facts, case studies, examples. Ideally, one contemporary and one historical, but both can be historical. One of your case studies is major. This is what we call depth. One of your case studies is minor. This is what we call breadth. Now, the depth case study goes into a great amount of detail. It is explaining why your case study backs up your argument. Having a second case study helps solidify your argument even more. This second case study, though, doesn't need the same amount of details. So our traditional model, there are some individuals who have written a different type of WRA2, but this is the structure that you are going to be using. This is just like what we see here, your paragraph 1, 2, 3, and 4. But let's go back to the traditional model page. In your first paragraph, now it's written as an upside down triangle with a circle. In that triangle format, you are doing your source analysis. So you evaluate the source, the ideology of the source, but also its significance and complexity. These are issues that are not simple. You need to be providing context here to explain that why is this ideology even relevant? Why are we talking about it? As you go through that source analysis, you end with your thesis. So you narrow the topic through a specific statement that answers the question. I cannot stress that point enough. Your thesis statement must answer the question. If you do not answer the question with your thesis does not exist. The next section here, we see the two rectangles. These are your two body paragraphs. Each one of these paragraphs should be about a page. I would say two-thirds of a page would be your minimum. It also does not need to go over a page, but that's your guideline. In here, you are discussing and evaluating your viewpoint by using specific case studies and examples. So you are showing why this is a superior stance and ideology. Discuss the opposing viewpoints using specific case studies and examples to show the flaws of this viewpoint. You do the exact same thing for both body paragraphs. At the end, we have what looks like an inverted image of the first paragraph, and that's what it is. In the conclusion, all we are doing is restating the thesis and the original argument. In the conclusion, you also acknowledge the importance or significance of the issue and its implications in the world or society. In your conclusion paragraph, you just summarize what you already said. Do not bring in new information. It's just a summary. So to recap, whoops. Paragraph 1 is your source analysis. So this is our upside down triangle. In here, we use IVDT. Now, what is I? I is interpret. So we begin with explicit. My apologies if this seems messy, but your explicit information is short. After explicit comes implicit. Implicit is the message. And here is where we see the V for values. What values does the source have? What values do they possess? You can find this by looking at things like the devices. Are they using metaphors? Are they using irony? Look into this. And then T, this is the thinkers. Who would agree or disagree with the source? There's got to be somebody. By bringing in a thinker, you're showing that you understand this to a great extent because you're able to draw in other people who have similar or contradictory beliefs. Now, one thing you can do in your first paragraph at the beginning is a brief introduction. Here you just introduce what the topic is. Now let's go back to our document and look at each paragraph in greater detail. So paragraph by paragraph tutorial outline. First paragraph. This is what I just mentioned. This is the context. Begin with a general introduction. Now it says here about the origins of nationalism. That's in social 20. In social 10, we're talking about globalization. So same thing though. Begin with a couple sentences expressing like what the topic is about. Maybe how it has evolved, how it has come to mean different things to different people or societies. This is an excellent opportunity here to define key terms being used. So, in Social 20, because the topic is going to be about nationalism, this is where you can define that term. Give a meaning, talk about the complexity of it, differing opinions on it. That can be done here. In Social 10, it's about globalization. This is just a nice way for the reader to start. It doesn't feel as abrupt, which can be good when somebody is marking it, especially when somebody is marking diplomas and they're marking all day long. It's nice to have a bit of an introduction. So your source analysis. Just like we already have talked about, this is where you identify and explain the perspectives expressed in the source. So it says here about 2 to 3 sentences. Like, what is their perspective? What do they think? What is that basic relationship to the principles of nationalism or globalization in grade 10? So explain the importance and significance of this issue. So the interactions. Now this may be reference to a nationalist, an ultranationalist, or internationalist ideas. So that'll be different depending on grade 10 or 12, 11, and then also depending on what unit. Next up, explain the context of the source. 2 to 3 sentences. What is the time period? What are the circumstances surrounding the author of this source? If it was written in 1914, that's a different time period and set of circumstances than if it was written in 1997. So you must give the speaker or the source a perspective. Here you can determine who would agree with the source? You can give both perspectives on the source as well. So you could provide a thinker who disagrees. So let's go back to this. So thinkers, they can either agree or disagree. Either way, you're demonstrating the author's perspective. By doing this, you are working your way to your position. This is bolded in a box because if you do not do the source analysis, you cannot get any higher than a source of 3 on any other part of your position paper. That is extremely important for you to be able to know. You have to do this paragraph. Now, your thesis statement. For some of you, this is going to be one of the most difficult parts of this paper. Others, this is going to come easier. So note that the question asks, to what extent? When someone is asking to what extent, that means it is not yes or no. It's not black or white. It could be anywhere on the spectrum. So therefore, you can either accept the entire nationalist source as it is, or you can accept only certain parts of the ideology while rejecting others, or you might completely reject the source. So identify the position you will be defending. That is your thesis statement. Now, the thesis comes at the end of the source analysis paragraph. So it should be the last 1 to 3 sentences. Now, we say 1 to 3 because for some people, your thesis will be one sentence. Other people's writing styles will have multiple sentences. So what is a thesis? A thesis is a position. Now, this doesn't mean that you say, I think. A thesis is essentially saying that you know something, and this is why. So you are creating a position, and you are answering to your topic question with reasons. So how do we establish a position? Your position must be clear. That doesn't mean you have to argue completely for or against the perspective presented in the source, but you do have to say how much you think it should be embraced. No matter what position you take, you must support it in the body of your essay. Let's go back to here. And let's talk about our thesis. We mentioned a thesis can land on a spectrum. Let's say on the right side, this is 100% agree. And over here on the left, 100% disagree. You can land anywhere on here. There is no one way to do this. There is no one right answer. Now, obviously, there's still the ability to say something that's incorrect. That's why performing a proper source analysis is important. But you can land anywhere here. If you say you fall here, then you would agree with the source to no extent. If you fall here, you agree with the source to the full extent. The rest of this, though, is also fair game. You can land anywhere here. If you're in the middle, you would say, to some extent, You fall over here, you might say something like, to a great extent. If you fall over here, you might say only a limited extent. But you can fall anywhere here. So here are some possible answers: to the full extent, to a great extent, to a certain extent, to the extent that, or to no extent. Try to use these phrases that are given here. They're there to help you. This spectrum that's given here, this shows you what the different positions would look like. Now, this is more towards a social 30. But let's say you're in the green. So governments should be able to suspend rights and freedoms anytime they see fit in order to stop forces that would threaten liberal democracy. It doesn't matter if you understand what that's talking about, but it says to be able to suspend freedoms anytime. That's why it's on the one extreme. You go to the other side, it's saying that governments are never justified in suspending rights and freedoms. Never is it what we would call an absolute. You need to be careful with using absolutes. In the middle, the individual takes a middle position. Now, there's differing opinions. Some people think that it's easier to write a WRA 2 by either fully agreeing or fully disagreeing with the source. It is easier to pick your case studies if you do this. However, it may limit you. If you pick somewhere in the middle, what you're going to do is you're going to say, here is why I think this way, but this is why it's not perfect. So how do I know if I've done a good job proving my thesis? There's a brick wall in the center here. You fall somewhere there. You're either strongly against or moderately against if you're on the not agreeing side. On the other side, you're either moderately for or strongly for. Oops. If you moderately agree with the source, explain why you do not strongly agree by using a conjunction or a subordinate. If you moderately disagree with the source, same thing. Explain why you do not strongly disagree by using a conjunction or a subordinate. Here's a quote. Your reader should know where you draw the line on the issue. This is especially important when taking the middle ground position. So no matter what position you take, the thesis states your ground or your opinion. If the reader does not know what your stance is after reading your thesis, you have not done a good job. So use a conjunction or a subordinate in your thesis when you are taking a moderate position. The subordinate, however, and the conjunction but work for drawing the line when writing a thesis statement that takes a certain extent approach. Here's some examples. These are examples of theses. So this should give you an idea of what a thesis looks like, even if you do not understand the subject material. So the welfare state's role in the economy is necessary to ensure the poorest of the poor are able to enjoy a decent quality of life. However, this is where they bring in that subordinate. However, if a culture of dependency is the result of such government-financed social programs, the government must respond with fiscal restraint. So here we are seeing a middle ground position. Here's another one. The national security of a nation should be the government's main priority. But that does mean the government has the right to completely ignore or infringe upon the civil liberties of its citizenry. Again, middle ground. Next one. Even though socialism values such principles of egalitarianism and social justice, the fact that it is an ideology made up of both utopian dreamers with no concept of reality and radical revolutionaries hell-bent on destroying the very economic freedom afforded to them cannot be ignored. By using the term even though, it is showing that your position is not to a full extent. Some of the other subordinates that you can use: although, because, unless, and even though. Some other conjunctions that might work are yet and so, but those might be less effective. When using conjunctions and subordinates, do not forget proper comma use. Subordinates require commas if you use them at the beginning of a sentence, so after the initial thought is over, but not when using them in the middle of sentences. Conjunctions require a comma when placed in between two independent clauses or complete thoughts and sentences. That covers our first paragraph. So all of paragraph 1 So paragraph 1, we have an intro, 2 to 3 sentences, so providing some context. Then you have your source analysis. If you see SA when I mark your paper, that just stands for source analysis. Source analysis. You use IVDT. You need to provide context and the perspectives. So either who would agree or disagree. This brings you to your thesis. So last 1 to 3 sentences. I recommend making your thesis towards the 1 sentence. But again, it can be a few. If your thesis is 4 or 5 sentences, it is not effective. Now, one thing I like to think of the thesis as, and I think if you look at your thesis this way, it'll help you. To me, the thesis is kind of like a map. It is going to tell the reader where the paper is going. So after reading a thesis, the reader has an idea of what to expect. I like to think of this as you go into Google Maps or something and you get directions. Then your thesis is kind of like it provides you the direction. But that is your first paragraph. Now let's get into your second paragraph. So paragraph 2 and 3, because they are the exact same format. So I'll put that here, same format. These are what we call your body paragraphs. In here you have arguments and evidence. To start every single body paragraph, we begin with a topic sentence. Your topic sentence identifies what your argument is, and your argument proves your thesis statement. So, begin with argument. Now I'm going to put up here your thesis, which you have one of, leads to your argument, which you end up having two of, one in each body paragraph. Your argument is like saying, so and so is true because this. So you are saying why your thesis is true. So if you say the ideological perspective of the source should be agreed with 100%, then your two arguments need to show why you agree with the thesis or with the ideological perspective 100%. Your argument has to be connected to your thesis. You also need to make sure that your argument does not prove your thesis wrong or contradict it. That's a big no-no. After your argument, which is one sentence, comes your examples or your evidence. So here you're identifying and detailing case studies or examples or evidence that proves your topic sentence. So again, everything comes back to the thesis. This is what I think is your thesis. Arguments is this is why I think it. And then your case studies prove your point. So identify and explain a detailed case study or several examples to illustrate why this argument is correct and how it strengthens your thesis. Evidence must be relevant and accurate, historical and or contemporary, and comprehensive. So again, you need to be elaborating. If you see E/E, that means elaborate and explain. You need to make sure you're doing that. Ideally, your evidence should have both depth and breadth, with a historically and contemporary case study. You do not need two main case studies, but one major and one minor. Make sure that your examples and evidence are linked to the source, and whether that's globalization or nationalism, whether you support or refute it, and then also your thesis. Here's where we practice something called embedding. Come back to the source when you're writing. This is a good thing to be doing because it shows that you're still interacting with the original part of this assignment, which is the source. You then conclude by restating your argument. This is called bookending. So you begin with an argument. Again, your argument proves your thesis. After your argument, you have two case studies. One we call depth. So great detail. Argument 2, breadth. Less detail, but still supporting your argument. So supports argument and thesis. So you have one thesis, two arguments, and then your case studies. And because you have two in each body paragraph, you have 4. One thesis plus 2 arguments plus 4 case studies. If any of those numbers don't add up, you need to go back and fix it. Now, when we talk about case studies, you need to make sure you're including the relevant information. If you're talking about German nationalism as a cause for World War I, don't spend your time talking about unnecessary details. Talk about what's relevant. At the end of your second or third paragraph, I'm going to use the term called bookending. If you've ever seen a bookend, they keep the books on a shelf from falling over. Bookends are usually the same thing. So you start your paragraph with an argument, you end your paragraph with the same argument. So a bookend is restate your argument. All right. This is the exact same thing for paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. The format does not change. One thing that is optional is including opposing arguments. You do not have to do this. Now, this is a summary of the position you'll be arguing against, so you would discuss why others may believe the opposite of your views. What you're doing here, if you choose to, you acknowledge that some people disagree with you. You then have to say why they would disagree with you. This can be useful though, because if you can acknowledge what another person thinks and then explain why they are wrong or why their logic is flawed, that is going to make your argument and thesis look even stronger. This is optional. You do not have to do it, but you may if you would like. Again, though, make sure that your examples are linked to the source or the ideology and your thesis. Your last paragraph. Your last paragraph should be somewhere around half a page, and it should only take you a few minutes to write. This is just a summary of all your arguments. You're acknowledging the complexity of the issue at hand, and you're restating your thesis. So avoid reusing the same key phrases or wording. Put it in different words. Let's create one new page here. So the source analysis paragraph looked like this: a triangle with a circle at the bottom. Your source analysis, then your thesis. Our conclusion paragraph is the opposite. Begin your conclusion paragraph by restating your thesis. So the ideological perspective of the source should be agreed or should be accepted to what extent. This is why I think so. And so in this section, summary of your arguments. One thing though, do not bring new information in here. This is not a place to all of a sudden say, oh, look, here's another reason why my opinion is true. That only belongs in your body paragraphs. While you're in your conclusion paragraph, do things like embed. So bring back to the source. Here you can make a final point about your position, why it's superior. Avoid saying things like in conclusion or to conclude, but offer some insight into the issue-based topic. Acknowledge the importance of the issue. Mention the perspective of the source one last time, either in support or refute. And then leave your reader thinking. A final thought will do. Your conclusion is your least important paragraph, but it's necessary to wrap up your WRA too. So keys to success. Effective interpretation of source throughout the paper. This is key. Refer back to the original source frequently. Again, that's embedding. You must have a clearly established position. If you do not, then you are not completing the assignment. One thing to keep in mind with this, and I've seen this done many times, your WRA2 is not just explaining what the source is. I've seen students write 4 paragraphs just explaining the source. That is not correct. You must come up with a position and then 2 arguments to support that position. So you create your established position and have thorough development of arguments relating them to the issue and source. Link evidence to arguments and to the source, so at least 2 fully developed case studies, that's the depth. Use vocabulary. You get to use a dictionary and thesaurus during the diploma, so there's no reason for you to be excluding important social studies vocabulary. Do not use I, or us, or we, or our. Avoid those terms. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, I don't ever want to read I think. This is not about what you think. It is about what you know. If you can say something is a certain way because, and you give actual reasons, this isn't you thinking. You're proving a point. So that's what we want to see. Quick checklist. I am going to let you read over this on your own. I'm going to go over another one, but let's go to this outline here. So here's the planning page. I highly recommend using this in your topic. What is it? Grade 10s, it's going to be about globalization. Be specific what type. Grade 11, it's going to be about nationalism. What type? So in your source analysis, include what is the specific ideological perspective? Why is it important? Why is it an issue? What are the values in the source? Who would oppose it? If you can put something in each of these spots in the planning page, you're going to do a great job. Then your position. This gives you a spectrum. Pick where you're going to land on the spectrum. Where do you draw the line? And then write your thesis statement in here. Okay. Body paragraph 1 and 2. Exact same thing. Start with your argument. That's your topic sentence. Provide evidence, link to your thesis, and then bookend. Conclusion. Restate thesis in different words, sum up your arguments, relate to the source analysis, and relate importance of finding a solution to this problem. Things that annoy teachers' checklist. The word things. If you say things, you're not being specific. Actually say what? This is the same as if somebody says etc. Don't say etc. Actually tell me what you mean. Avoid personal pronouns. I, you, we, us. Avoid contractions. So instead of saying don't, say do not. Avoid being emotional in storytelling. Oftentimes, students will go off on what I call a rant. This does not belong in a WRA 2. If you're just telling me a story about how you feel, you're not doing the assignment. Fully explain all examples with relevant info, right? Who, what, where, when, why, and how. Avoid rhetorical questions. Follow position paper format outlined on document. Avoid absolutes. Now, an absolute is something like never or always. If you say something like that, I can guarantee you that I can give you an example that proves that it's not 100%. The second you do that, you are now wrong. That is why we say things like oftentimes or most or sometimes. What are some of the other things? Read through all of what I have here in this checklist. These are all important. Here's another checklist. Read through all these things. Now let's go back to one more page. Grammar and spelling. Well, let's actually talk about the rubric. So this is out of 75 marks. Your WRA 1 is out of 50. Your source analysis, 20. Next up, we have your quality of arguments. This includes your thesis and your arguments. Out of 20. Evidence, 20. communication, "15. If you do not do your source analysis, you cannot get more than a 3 in any of these other categories. It's extremely important that you understand how this rubric works. Now, this 15 in communication, that's a lot. Your WRA 1 is 5. So, for those of you that don't like to take time to edit, you're going to get nailed on communication. So, no contractions. Don't use contractions. There, there, there. Use these correctly. 2, 2, 2. Apostrophes. Canada's approach, which then capital letters. The more errors I find, the less you get out of 15. That wraps up the WRA 2. Remember, you have a source analysis, a thesis, which tells the reader what your position is, where you're going. You have arguments, evidence, and then a conclusion. Thanks for listening. Good luck.